They vanished in ones and twos, always at night, always without warning, swallowed by the shadows of a collapsing empire. Imagine the chilling, creeping dread that settled over the U.S. intelligence community as its most valuable human sources inside the Soviet Union began to disappear off the map. A sharp, percussive knock on a Moscow apartment door in the dead of night, a quick, brutally forceful shove into a waiting sedan, then an unnerving and absolute silence. There would be no trial, no public announcement, not even a fabricated cause of death, just a gaping, terrifying hole where a trusted, high-level, and irreplaceable asset used to be. The silence was the worst part. It was a void that screamed. By the end of 1985, a conservative estimate put the number at 10 of the CIA's most invaluable sources, men who had risked everything, who had been systematically arrested, interrogated in the bowels of the infamous Lefortovo prison, and then summarily executed with a single bullet to the back of the head. For years, the agency, along with its FBI counterparts, was utterly paralyzed by a toxic mixture of confusion and visceral fear, completely unable to comprehend the catastrophic, hemorrhaging failure that was unfolding from within their own ranks. The terrifying truth, when it finally clawed its way into the light, was more mundane and therefore profoundly more horrifying than any spy novel plot. The monster who had handed these agents over to the KGB wasn't some shadowy, ideologically driven phantom dispatched from Moscow. He was one of their own, a gray, mid-level CIA officer named Aldrich Ames. He was a man who drove a flashy gold-colored Jaguar, lived in a sprawling $500,000 house brought with untraceable stacks of cash, and often spent his extended lunch breaks sipping expensive margaritas. He was a man so seemingly ordinary, so utterly and comprehensively unremarkable, that for years no one even thought to suspect him. On a cold February 21, 1994, the FBI finally snapped a pair of handcuffs on him outside his Arlington townhouse. By then, the damage was done. He had already inflicted more catastrophic and lasting damage on American intelligence than any single spy in the nation's history. His betrayal wasn't just a simple breach of security protocols. It was a silent, methodical, and personalized slaughter of the very individuals who had risked their lives and their families' futures for the United States. This is the story of Aldrich Ames, the traitor who sent 10 CIA agents to their deaths, the spy who was hidden in plain sight, the man whose greed destroyed a generation of American intelligence. Rick Ames never looked the part of a future arch-traitor. He didn't have the swagger or the steely gaze of a cinematic spy. Colleagues from his long 31-year career at the CIA remembered a polite, almost frustratingly bookish man who often wore the same rumpled tweed jacket day after day and seemed constitutionally allergic to making direct eye contact. He was the kind of person who faded so completely into the institutional background, a human chameleon who was easily and consistently overlooked in the bustling, ego-driven corridors of power at Langley. He joined the CIA in 1962, fresh out of college, a product of a thoroughly and forgettably middle-class upbringing. His father, Carlton Ames, had been a CIA officer himself, though not a particularly distinguished one. The elder Ames had worked in Burma and spent his career in middling positions, never breaking into the upper echelons of the agency's elite. Rick Ames grew up in the shadow of his father's modest achievements, absorbing the culture of intelligence work from an early age, But unlike his father, Rick seemed to lack the natural aptitude or the burning ambition that characterized the agency's rising stars. This background, so far removed from the polished Ivy League elites or the hardened military veterans who often populated the agency's upper echelons, perhaps contributed directly to his perceived harmlessness. He was just good old Rick. His initial assignments were quiet, mundane, and entirely unglamorous. He began his career as a junior analyst in the Soviet East European Division, a glorified clerk sifting through mountains of dry reports and compiling data that rarely led anywhere exciting. The work was tedious, repetitive, and soul-crushing in its bureaucratic monotony. While other young officers were being groomed for field operations or high-level analytical positions, Ames shuffled papers and attended meetings where his contributions were rarely noticed or valued. His first overseas posting was to Ankara, Turkey, a common and uninspired starting point for young officers. There, his primary duty was to attend endless diplomatic social functions, nursing a drink while observing Soviet diplomats, hoping for a single indiscreet comment that never came. The work was mind-numbing. Night after night, he would stand in reception halls, making small talk with diplomats who were just as bored as he was, searching for any scrap of useful intelligence. The victories were small and infrequent. The boredom was crushing. He spent 3 years in Ankara, and by the end of his tour, his performance reviews reflected a troubling pattern. He was competent, but never dazzling. He completed assignments, but rarely went beyond the minimum requirements. His supervisors noted a lack of initiative, a tendency to blend into the background rather than stand out. When he returned to Langley in the late 1960s, he was assigned to the Mexico City station, a posting that should have reinvigorated his career. Mexico City was a Cold War hotspot, a place where CIA officers could make their names for themselves by recruiting Soviet intelligence officers looking to defect. But Ames's tour in Mexico City was marked by failure and embarrassment. He was assigned to recruit Soviet KGB officers, but his efforts were clumsy and ineffective. He developed a reputation for drinking too much at embassy functions. Colleagues whispered that he couldn't hold his liquor, that he became sloppy and indiscreet after a few drinks. One incident became legendary within the small circle of officers who knew him. On a diplomatic reception, Ames had approached a Soviet cultural attaché, suspected to be KGB, and attempted to initiate a recruitment pitch. But Ames was drunk. His approach was obvious, ham-fisted, and embarrassing. The Soviet officer reported the incident to his superiors, and the entire operation was blown before it ever began. Ames's supervisors were furious. The incident went into his file as a serious black mark. He was counseled about his drinking. He was told to be more professional, more disciplined, but nothing seemed to change. By the early 1980s, he found himself back at Langley, stuck behind a desk in a professional purgatory, watching younger, more ambitious peers ascend the career ladder while he shuffled papers. The promotions he craved arrived with agonizing slowness. He saw colleagues who had joined the agency after him rise to positions of authority while he remained entrapped in middle management. The resentment grew like a cancer inside him. His personal life was equally troubled. His first marriage, to Nancy Segabarth, a fellow CIA officer, was disintegrating. The couple had grown apart over the years. Nancy was ambitious, driven, and increasingly frustrated with Rick's mediocrity. The marriage became a battlefield of silent resentments and bitter arguments. The divorce, finalized in 1983, was messy and expensive. Nancy wanted her share of their modest assets. Rick, who had never been good with money, found himself drowning in legal fees and credit card debt. The financial pressure was suffocating. This simmering, deep-seated professional resentment, this feeling of being perpetually undervalued and overlooked, began to curdle inside him, compounded by a pending and messy divorce from his first wife, a fellow CIA officer, and a mountain of mounting credit card debt from reckless spending. Ames was in a state of quiet, suffocating desperation. In 1981, while still married to Nancy, Ames met Maria del Rosario Casas Dupuy in Mexico City. Rosario, as she was known, was a Colombian cultural attaché working at the Colombian embassy. She was younger than Rick, attractive, sophisticated, and came from what she described as a wealthy Colombian family. Ames was immediately smitten. Rosario represented everything his dreary life lacked: excitement, beauty, status, and wealth. Ames was immediately smitten. Rosario represented everything his dreary life lacked: excitement, beauty, status, and wealth. Her affair began while Ames was still married to Nancy, adding another layer of deception to his already complicated life. Rosario had expensive tastes. She liked designer clothes, upscale restaurants, luxury travel. She expected Rick to provide the lifestyle she believed she deserved. And Rick, desperate to keep her, began spending money he didn't have. By 1983, when his divorce was finalized and he married Rosario, Rick Ames was in financial freefall. His credit cards were maxed out. He was taking cash advances to pay off other credit cards. He was borrowing money from friends and family. The debt was approaching $50,000, a crushing burden on his CIA salary of roughly $60,000 per year. His growing appetite for a lifestyle he couldn't remotely afford made him financially and emotionally vulnerable. He was a man ripe for the picking, though no one, least of all the institution that trained him to spot such vulnerabilities, seemed to notice. The institutional blindness was stunning. Ames worked in counterintelligence, the very division responsible for detecting spies and protecting agency secrets. His colleagues should have noticed the warning signs. They should have seen the financial stress, the drinking problem, the desperate need for money. But they didn't, or they chose not to. The CIA's culture at the time was one of gentlemanly trust. Officers were expected to police themselves. Financial troubles were considered private matters, not security concerns. And Rick Ames had spent his entire career being forgettable, unremarkable, invisible. He was exactly the kind of person no one suspected, and that made him perfect. April 16, 1985 was a day that would forever and irrevocably alter the course of Cold War espionage. On that seemingly ordinary spring morning, Aldrich Ames left his office at CIA headquarters, walked the 2 blocks to the imposing Soviet embassy on Wisconsin Avenue in Washington, D.C., and stepped across a threshold from which he could never return. It was a brazen, almost suicidally reckless move for a serving CIA officer. The Soviet embassy was one of the most heavily monitored buildings in Washington. FBI surveillance teams photographed everyone who entered. The CIA tracked all American citizens who made contact with Soviet diplomatic facilities. Walking through that door should have been career suicide. It should have triggered immediate investigation. But Ames gambled, correctly, that the sheer audacity of his move would provide its own cover. No real traitor would be so obvious, so clumsy. His brazenness became his camouflage. But he wasn't there to defect. He was there to make a business transaction. He carried with him a horrifying offer, a package of human lives. Ames requested a meeting with the KGB resident, the station chief. He identified himself as a CIA officer, a stunning admission that immediately got him ushered into a secure room. There, he made his pitch. For the sum of $50,000, he would identify Soviet officials who were secretly working for American and Allied intelligence services. He had the names, the operational details, the case files. He had access to everything. The KGB officers listening to him must have been stunned. Unsolicited walk-ins were common. Disgruntled employees, wannabe spies, delusional conspiracy theorists. But a senior CIA officer from Counterintelligence offering to betray his country's most sensitive secrets for cash? This was unprecedented. They tested him. They asked questions only a real CIA officer would know. They probed for inconsistencies, for signs of a setup, for evidence that this was an elaborate FBI sting operation. But Ames had answers to everything. He knew operational details. He knew classified procedures. He knew the names of operations and the identities of officers. He was the real thing. The KGB, utterly stunned by the unsolicited intelligence goldmine that had just walked through their front door, quickly and eagerly agreed to his terms. Ames handed over the names of 2 KGB double agents who were operating out of the Soviet embassy right there in Washington. It was that simple, that shockingly unceremonious, trading human lives for a thick stack of cash in the middle of a weekday. The 2 agents Ames betrayed in that first meeting were Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin. Both were KGB officers working under diplomatic cover in Washington. Both had been recruited by the FBI. Both were providing invaluable intelligence about KGB operations in the United States. Martinov, codenamed Gentile, had been recruited in 1982. He was a KGB Line X officer, responsible for scientific and technical intelligence gathering. He provided information about Soviet efforts to steal American technology, about KGB officers operating in the United States, about Soviet intelligence priorities. Motorin, codenamed Megas, had worked in the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, responsible for internal security and counterintelligence. His information was even more sensitive. He revealed Soviet surveillance techniques, identified KGB agents, and provided insights into how the KGB operated inside the Soviet Union. Both men had families, both had children, both had risked everything to work with American intelligence. And in a single afternoon, for $50,000, Aldrich Ames sentenced them to death. The sheer ease of it, the sudden empowerment must have been intoxicating for a man who had felt so powerless and insignificant for so long. Within a matter of weeks, heavily encrypted cables carried his devastating information back to Moscow, and the KGB's Internal Security Directorate began to roll up the CIA's painstakingly built network. In Moscow, the information Ames provided was treated with the highest priority. The KGB's Second Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence, began the planning of the arrests. They couldn't move too quickly. That would alert the CIA that they had a source inside American intelligence. They had to be careful, methodical. Martinov was recalled to Moscow in May 1985, just weeks after Ames's betrayal. He was told there was an urgent matter requiring his attention. He suspected nothing. He boarded the Aeroflot flight from Washington to Moscow, believing he would return in a few days. He never did. Upon landing in Moscow, Martinov was met at the airport by KGB security officers. He was arrested immediately, handcuffed, and driven to Lefortovo prison, the notorious Moscow detention facility where the KGB held its most sensitive prisoners. The interrogation lasted for months. The KGB wanted to know everything: how the FBI had recruited him, what information he had provided, whether there were other Soviet officers working for American intelligence. Martinoff knew what was coming. He knew that Soviet traitors faced only one punishment, but he held out hope that perhaps his cooperation during interrogation might save his life, or at least protect his family from retribution. It didn't. On September 24, 1987, Valery Martinoff was taken to the basement of Lefortovo prison. He was forced to kneel. A KGB officer placed a pistol against the back of his head and pulled the trigger. His body was cremated. His family was never told where his ashes were scattered. Sergei Motorin met the same fate. He was recalled to Moscow in June 1985, arrested upon arrival, interrogated for months, and executed in September 1987, the same day as Martinoff. The next month, Ames, his pockets considerably heavier, walked into a dealership and bought a brand new Jaguar. Shortly after, he and his new wife, Rosario, purchased a $540,000 house in Arlington, Virginia, paying for it entirely in cash. A $500,000 home and a luxury foreign car on a CIA salary of roughly $70,000 a year should have triggered every alarm bell in the intelligence community. But incredibly, this glaring, pulsating red flag was met with a catastrophic and ultimately deadly lack of curiosity. The problem was institutional culture. The CIA in the 1980s operated on a system of trust. Officers were gentlemen spies, Ivy League graduates, products of elite backgrounds. The idea that one of their own would betray the agency for money was almost inconceivable. Moreover, financial oversight was lax. Officers were required to file annual financial disclosure forms, but these were cursory at best. As long as you listed your salary and major assets, no one looked deeper. No one checked bank accounts. No one investigated large cash purchases. Ames's supervisors knew he had money problems in the early 1980s. They knew about his expensive divorce. Some of them even knew he was living beyond his means. But when his financial situation suddenly and dramatically improved in 1985, no one asked why. The assumption was that Rosario's family money had solved his problems. It was a convenient explanation that required no further investigation. And because asking about a colleague's finances was considered impolite, almost no one pressed the issue. One colleague did ask. At a Christmas party in 1985, a fellow CIA officer noticed Ames's new Jaguar and jokingly asked how he could afford it on a government salary. Ames smiled and said, "Rosario's family, Colombian money." The colleague laughed and moved on. He never reported the conversation. He never thought it was suspicious. After all, Colombian families did have money, coffee, emeralds, legitimate businesses. Why wouldn't Rosario's family be wealthy? No one bothered to check. No one called the Bogota station and asked them to verify the story. No one looked at bank records to see where the money was actually coming from. And so Aldrich Ames, having successfully murdered 2 men and gotten away with it, began to plan his next betrayal. Having successfully betrayed Martinoff and Motorin without detection, Aldrich Ames grew bolder. The KGB was ecstatic with the intelligence he had provided. They wanted more, and Ames, now addicted to the money and the sense of power it gave him, was happy to oblige. In June 1985, just 2 months after his first betrayal, Ames prepared a package that would decimate American intelligence operations inside the Soviet Union for a generation. He compiled a list of every Soviet official working for the CIA, every name, every code name, every operational detail. He gathered classified documents detailing recruitment techniques, communication methods, and planned operations. He copied files, memorized names, and prepared a comprehensive intelligence package. On June 13, 1985, Ames met with his KGB handler at a restaurant in Georgetown. Over lunch, in a manila envelope placed casually on the table, he handed over the entire network. The package contained more than 20 names. These weren't low-level sources providing minor intelligence. These were senior Soviet officials, military officers, KGB personnel, people with access to the highest levels of Soviet government and military planning. Each name represented years of patient cultivation by CIA case officers. Each name represented enormous risk. These sources faced execution if discovered. Each name represented invaluable intelligence that had shaped American understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. And Ames sold them all for cash. The KGB couldn't believe their fortune. In a single afternoon, they had learned the identity of virtually every American intelligence asset operating inside the Soviet Union. It was an intelligence coup of almost unimaginable proportions. But they faced a problem. If they arrested everyone immediately, the CIA would know they had a mole, and a high-level one with access to the most sensitive information. The KGB needed to be strategic. They needed to make the arrests seem random, to disguise the pattern, to prevent the Americans from realizing the full scope of the penetration. So they rolled up the network slowly, methodically, over months and years. Some arrests came quickly. Others were delayed. Some sources were allowed to continue operating under KGB control, feeding disinformation to their CIA handlers. The repercussions of Ames's betrayal were swift, brutal, and strategically devastating. One of the single most significant losses was Major General Dmitry Polyakov of the GRU, Soviet Military Intelligence. Codenamed Top Hat by the FBI and Bourbon by the CIA, Polyakov had been one of America's most important and productive assets for nearly 2 decades, providing priceless intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, strategic intentions, and insights into the Sino-Soviet split. Polyakov was an extraordinary source. He had joined the GRU in the 1940s and risen through the ranks to become a general officer. He had served in Burma, India, and the United States. He had access to some of the Soviet military's most closely guarded secrets. He was motivated not by money, but by a profound disillusionment with the corruption and hypocrisy of the Soviet regime. He had watched the Soviet system destroy talented officers while promoting incompetent party loyalists. He had seen the gap between communist ideals and Soviet reality. He wanted to help the West because he believed the Soviet system was fundamentally broken. Polyakov's intelligence was invaluable. He provided detailed information on Soviet military doctrine, weapons systems, and strategic planning. He revealed Soviet assessments of Chinese military capabilities during the Sino-Soviet split. He warned about Soviet military adventures and helped American intelligence anticipate Soviet moves during numerous Cold War crises. After Ames casually exposed him for cash, Polyakov was arrested in 1986. The KGB had to be careful. Polyakov was a general officer with connections throughout the Soviet military establishment. His arrest had to be handled delicately. He was taken into custody quietly, without public announcement. For 2 years, he was held in Lefortovo prison and subjected to intense interrogation. The KGB wanted to know everything: how he had been recruited, what information he had provided, whether there were other Soviet officers working for American intelligence. Polyakov was 62 years old when he was arrested. He had a wife and children. He knew what was coming, but he faced his fate with dignity. In 1988, after 2 years of interrogation, Dmitry Polyakov was executed by firing squad. His family was informed that he had died of natural causes. His true cause of death wasn't revealed until after the fall of the Soviet Union. Another incredibly close call involved Oleg Gordievsky, the KGB station chief, or resident, in London, who was secretly working for Britain's MI6. Gordievsky was one of the West's most valuable sources inside the KGB. He had been recruited by MI6 in 1974 while serving in Copenhagen. By 1985, he had risen to become the KGB's station chief in London, one of the most sensitive positions in Soviet foreign intelligence. Gordievsky provided MI6 and, through them, the CIA, with extraordinary intelligence. He revealed KGB operations throughout Europe. He identified KGB officers and agents. Most importantly, he provided insights into Soviet thinking during some of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, including the 1983 Able Archer crisis, when the Soviets nearly launched a preemptive nuclear strike, believing NATO was preparing to attack. Betrayed by Ames in May 1985, Gordievsky was abruptly recalled to Moscow in the summer of 1985. The message was urgent: return immediately for consultations. Gordievsky suspected nothing. Such recalls were routine. But upon arriving in Moscow, Gordievsky was summoned to KGB headquarters. There, he was drugged and subjected to a hostile interrogation. The KGB didn't have enough evidence to arrest him outright. MI6's operational security had been excellent, but they had Ames's information, and they knew Gordievsky was working for the British. The interrogation lasted for hours. Gordievsky, despite being drugged, maintained his innocence. He denied everything. Without a confession or hard evidence, the KGB couldn't formally arrest him, but they placed him under intensive surveillance and stripped him of his position. Sensing his imminent doom, Gordievsky activated a long-dormant, high-risk escape plan that MI6 had prepared years earlier. The plan involved traveling to the Finnish border and signaling MI6 officers waiting on the other side. In a daring operation, Gordievsky evaded KGB surveillance, traveled to the Finnish border, and was smuggled out of the country by MI6 agents in the trunk of a diplomatic car, a harrowing journey to freedom. He spent hours cramped in the trunk as the car passed through Soviet checkpoints. Border guards searched the vehicle but failed to discover him. Gordievsky made it to safety in Finland and from there to Britain. He was one of the few sources betrayed by Ames who survived. But his escape alerted the CIA that something was terribly wrong. A high-level KGB officer working for MI6 had been compromised. How? The list of people who knew about Gordievsky was very small. The leak had to be coming from someone with access to the most sensitive compartmented information. The mole hunt began. By 1989, the CIA was in a state of outright panic. A deeply disturbing pattern had emerged that could no longer be ignored. Nearly every Soviet source the agency tried to contact was either immediately compromised or had already been turned by the KGB and was now feeding them disinformation. The agency's carefully constructed intelligence networks, built over decades at enormous cost and risk, were crumbling to dust. Operations that should have succeeded were failing. Sources who should have been secure were being arrested. Dead drops were being watched by the KGB. It became terrifyingly and undeniably clear that a mole was operating at a high level within the U.S. intelligence apparatus. A counterintelligence investigation was finally launched, but it was agonizingly slow. hampered by bureaucratic inertia and fierce, self-defeating turf wars between the CIA and the FBI, which prevented effective information sharing for too long. The turf war was real and destructive. The CIA insisted the mole was probably in the FBI. The FBI insisted the mole was probably in the CIA. Neither agency wanted to believe the problem was internal. Neither agency wanted to cooperate fully with the other. Meanwhile, Ames continued to show up for work every day, sitting in on debriefings, learning the identities of new assets, and forwarding their names to Moscow for another finder's fee. On paper, Ames earned a respectable government salary, but it was nowhere near enough to fund the lavish and conspicuously consumptive lifestyle he and his second wife Rosario began to cultivate with abandon. His Amex bills ballooned to unmanageable levels, showing a pattern of frequent dinners at Washington's most upscale restaurants, shopping sprees for designer suits, and a constant stream of other luxury purchases that were wildly out of sync with his known income. Ames developed a taste for expensive wine. He would order bottles costing hundreds of dollars at restaurants. He traveled frequently, first-class flights to Europe, luxury hotels, designer shopping. He bought Rosario expensive jewelry, designer bags, fur coats. The couple renovated their Arlington home with expensive upgrades: Italian marble countertops, custom cabinetry, a wine cellar. The renovations alone cost over $100,000, more than Ames's annual salary. When curious colleagues occasionally inquired about his sudden, inexplicable affluence, Ames offered a convenient, vague, and easily digestible cover story. His wife's family in Colombia was immensely wealthy, the beneficiaries of a vast fortune. This flimsy, almost laughable explanation, based on non-existent coffee plantations and imaginary emerald mines, was surprisingly and tragically effective. No one in the agency, perhaps out of a misguided sense of politeness or a deep-seated institutional complacency, cared to investigate this convenient narrative any further. Meanwhile, the KGB continued to pay him for his treachery, ultimately funneling a staggering total of $4.6 million into Ames's hands over the course of 9 years, making him the highest-paid spy in the history of espionage. The money was delivered through classic, time-tested spycraft, thick sacks of cash left in prearranged dead drops under bridges and in wooded parks, and clandestine face-to-face meetings in foreign cities like Bogota and Vienna. The dead drop locations were chosen carefully: parks in Northern Virginia, areas under highway overpasses, wooded spots where Ames could make a quick stop, retrieve a package, and drive away without being noticed. The KGB would mark the location with a simple signal: a chalk mark on a mailbox, a piece of tape on a signpost. Ames would recognize the signal, know that a package was waiting, and make the pickup at his convenience. Inside the packages, bundles of cash, usually $50,000 or $100,000 at a time, wrapped in plastic and stuffed into shopping bags. Also included, instructions for the next meeting, questions from Moscow, requests for specific intelligence. Ames was not driven by some grand ideology or a principled opposition to American foreign policy. As he would later admit with chilling candor, his motive was brutally simple. He just wanted to stop worrying about bounced checks and the crushing, humiliating weight of personal debt. But that financial comfort came at an unimaginable price. Each time his bank balance dipped, he would mail another list of names to his handlers. With chilling, transactional predictability, the arrests and executions continued in Moscow, with each payment serving as a blood-stained entry in his financial ledger. By 1990, the mole hunt had finally intensified. The losses were too catastrophic, the pattern too obvious. The CIA and FBI formed a joint task force, pooling resources and sharing information that should have been shared years earlier. The task force was codenamed ANLACE,
It was staffed by experienced counterintelligence officers from both agencies. Their mission: find the mole before he could do any more damage. The investigators knew certain facts. The compromises had begun in 1985. The mole had access to highly compartmented information. The mole knew about both CIA and FBI operations. The mole had to be someone senior, someone trusted, someone with broad access.
The investigators painstakingly narrowed their list of potential suspects to fewer than 24 officers who had the specific access required to know about all the compromised cases. Aldrich Ames was on that list, but so were several more prominent, high-ranking officers. Few in the investigation wanted to believe that the mediocre, background-blending paper pusher could be the monster they were looking for. The institutional bias was to search for a disgruntled genius, a brilliant but rebellious officer, not a bumbling, perpetually indebted functionary. Surely the mole was someone impressive, someone with the intellect and cunning to evade detection for so long. Ames didn't fit that profile. He was average, unremarkable. How could someone like that be responsible for the greatest intelligence disaster in CIA history? The breakthrough came not from classic spycraft or a lucky break, but from painstaking, methodical, financial detective work. One investigator on the task force suggested a radical approach: follow the money. If the mole was being paid by the Soviets, there would be a financial trail. Large sums of money couldn't simply appear without leaving traces. The task force began the arduous process of subpoenaing bank records for everyone on the suspect list. It was tedious work, requiring court orders, cooperation from banks, and careful analysis of thousands of transactions. They soon uncovered the massive $540,000 cash payment for Ames's Arlington house, a transaction that was utterly impossible on his government salary. The house purchase was the first major red flag. How could a GS-14 CIA officer afford a $500,000 home? And why pay cash? Most people took out mortgages. Paying cash was unusual and suspicious. Digging deeper, they discovered a clear pattern of large, regular cash deposits made into his accounts, almost always in increments just under the $10,000 federal reporting requirement, a classic money laundering technique known as structuring. Banks are required to report cash deposits over $10,000 to the federal government. It's an anti-money laundering measure designed to detect criminal activity. But if you deposit $9,500 repeatedly, you stay under the reporting threshold. Ames was doing exactly that. Deposits of $9,000, $8,500, $9,800, always just under $10,000, over and over again. It was a clear pattern of someone trying to hide large amounts of cash. Then came the final, crushing blow to his flimsy alibi. Investigators dispatched to South America found that Rosario's family in Bogota lived in a modest, struggling apartment. There was no family fortune, no coffee plantations, no emerald mines. Rosario's family was working class. Her father had been a mid-level government employee. Her mother worked in education. They lived comfortably, but modestly. There was no wealth, no inheritance, no family business generating millions. The entire story had been a lie, and now the investigators knew it. The money was undeniably coming from somewhere else, and given the timing of the deposits, coinciding exactly with the compromises of Soviet sources, there was only one possible conclusion. The glaring red flags that had been willfully ignored for years now formed an undeniable, incriminating trail leading directly to H. Aldrich Hazen Ames. The task force brought their findings to senior leadership. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. Ames had the access.
He had unexplained wealth. He had been lying about the source of his money, and the timing matched perfectly. But they needed more. They needed proof that would hold up in court. They needed to catch him in the act. The FBI took over the investigation. They began intensive surveillance of Ames. They tracked his movements, monitored his phone calls, watched his house. They were looking for evidence of contact with Russian intelligence. By this time, the Soviet Union had collapsed. The KGB had been dissolved and replaced by the SVR, Russia's new foreign intelligence service. But the spy game continued. The Russians still valued Ames. He was still providing intelligence, still being paid, and the FBI believed they could catch him making contact with his handlers. For months, they watched. They photographed him leaving his house, going to work, running errands. They put listening devices in his trash. They tracked his car. They monitored his credit card purchases. And they found something. Ames was making regular trips to dead drop sites. The FBI surveillance teams photographed him stopping at specific locations, getting out of his car, picking up packages, and driving away. They recovered some of the packages before Ames could retrieve them. Inside, thick bundles of cash and instructions written in Russian. They also discovered that Ames was using chalk marks to signal his Russian handlers. A mark on a mailbox meant he had information to deliver. A mark on a utility pole meant he needed a meeting. The FBI had him, but they needed one more piece of evidence. They needed to catch him with classified documents, preparing to deliver them to his handlers. February 21, 1994, dawned gray and cold in Arlington, Virginia. For months, a dedicated FBI surveillance team had Ames under constant microscopic observation, cataloging his every move, his every meeting, his every phone call. The FBI knew that Ames was planning to leave the country. He had scheduled a trip to Moscow, ostensibly for official CIA business, but the FBI suspected he was planning to defect. If he made it to Russia, he would be beyond their reach forever. They had to move quickly. They had enough evidence to arrest him, but they wanted to catch him with classified documents to make the case absolutely airtight. On February 21, 1994, as Ames left his house, he was arrested. The FBI agents ignored his protests. They handcuffed him, searched him, and placed him in the back of an FBI vehicle. Within minutes, he was being driven to FBI headquarters for interrogation. Moments later, another FBI team raided his home and arrested a terrified Rosario, who was still in her bathrobe, preparing for her day. She screamed as agents burst through the door with weapons drawn. She had known about Rick's espionage. She had helped him, traveled with him to meetings, spent the money he brought home. Inside the house, the evidence was damning and immediate. They found a shopping bag in Rick's study containing printed Russian intelligence instructions for future dead drops and signal sites, a damning piece of physical evidence that directly linked him to his handlers and sealed his fate. They found documents detailing upcoming meetings in Moscow. They found notes written in Russian. They found classified CIA documents that Ames had taken home, documents he had no authorization to possess. In a safe in the basement, they found over $10,000 in cash. They found jewelry purchased with Russian money. They found bank statements showing the structured deposits that had raised the initial red flags. The evidence filled several trucks. The FBI seized computers, documents, photographs, financial records, everything that might provide insight into the scope of Ames's betrayal.
The 9-year reign of terror, conducted by the most destructive and greedy spy in American history, was finally and abruptly over. The arrest made immediate headlines. The media descended on the story. The CIA spy who betrayed his country for money. The traitor who sent agents to their deaths. The greatest intelligence disaster in American history. At CIA headquarters, the news spread like wildfire. Officers who had worked with Ames couldn't believe it. Good old Rick? The guy who wore rumpled suits and never said much? He was the mole? But as the evidence became public, the shock turned to anger, then to shame. How had they missed this? How had someone so obviously living beyond his means evaded detection for so long? The institutional reckoning had begun. Aldrich Ames pleaded guilty to espionage and tax evasion on April 28, 1994. The decision to plead guilty was strategic. The evidence against him was overwhelming. If he went to trial, he would almost certainly be convicted and could face the death penalty. His lawyers negotiated a deal. Ames would plead guilty to all charges. He would submit to a full debriefing, revealing everything he had done, everyone he had betrayed, every dollar he had received. In exchange, he would receive life in prison without the possibility of parole, and prosecutors would agree not to seek the death penalty. More importantly for Ames, Rosario would receive a reduced sentence. She would be charged as an accomplice but would serve only 5 years. This was Ames's one act of something resembling decency. He wanted to protect his wife from spending the rest of her life in prison. To avoid the death penalty for himself and to secure a more lenient sentence for his wife, he agreed to a life sentence without the possibility of parole and promised a full, comprehensive debriefing on the extent of his betrayal. The debriefing lasted for months. CIA and FBI interrogators sat with Ames for hours every day, going through every operation he had compromised, every document he had stolen, every meeting he had attended with his Russian handlers. The final damage assessment filled 20 thick volumes, a library of treachery, detailing over 100 compromised intelligence operations and confirming the execution of at least 10 vital U.S. sources, and others whose names remain classified even today. The CIA's human intelligence network inside Russia was not just damaged, it was crippled for an entire generation. It would take years, decades even, to rebuild even a fraction of what was lost. The institutional damage was equally severe. Foreign intelligence services that had cooperated with the CIA now questioned whether the Americans could be trusted with sensitive information. Allied agencies began limiting their intelligence sharing, worried that their own sources might be compromised. Recruitment of new sources inside Russia became almost impossible. Word spread in Russian intelligence circles that working for the Americans was a death sentence. The CIA had failed to protect its agents. Why would anyone risk working with them? Rosario Ames received a 5-year prison sentence for her role as a witting accomplice and for tax evasion. She had known about Rick's espionage from the beginning. She had helped him signal his handlers. She had traveled with him to meetings in Bogota and Vienna. She had spent the money, knowing exactly where it came from. During her trial, Rosario showed little remorse. She claimed she had been manipulated by her husband, that she hadn't understood the full implications of what they were doing. But the evidence showed otherwise. She had been an active participant, not an innocent dupe. Upon her release in 1999, she promptly divorced Ames and returned to her family in Colombia. She has never spoken publicly about the case. She lives quietly in Bogota, largely forgotten by history.
Ames, meanwhile, remains in federal prison. He is currently incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution in Terre Haute, Indiana, serving his life sentence without the possibility of parole. In prison, Ames has given occasional interviews. He has expressed no real remorse for his actions. He acknowledges what he did, but claims he didn't fully appreciate the consequences at the time. He says he was under financial pressure and made bad decisions.
However, the shocking arrest of FBI agent Robert Hanssen for similar, long-running crimes of espionage just 7 years later proved that the deeply rooted problem of internal betrayal was far from solved. Hanssen, like Ames, was a mid-level officer who had sold secrets to the Russians for money. Like Ames, he had evaded detection for years. Like Ames, his betrayal led to the execution of U.S. sources. The Hanssen case proved that the institutional reforms after Ames had been insufficient. The intelligence community had failed to learn the most important lesson: trust, but verify. No one, no matter how long they've served, no matter how trusted they are, should be above suspicion. In a prison interview years later, Aldrich Ames offered a chillingly simple and pathetic explanation for his actions: money. There was no grand ideology, no political disillusionment with the American system, no complex psychological motive. Just a man drowning in debt who saw an easy and lucrative way out. But psychologists who have studied the case see something more complex. Criminologists and psychologists often use the fraud triangle to explain such white-collar acts, a combination of pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Ames was a textbook case, embodying all three elements perfectly. The pressure came from crippling personal debt and an insatiable desire to fund his and Rosario's extravagant lifestyle. By 1985, Ames was drowning financially. His divorce had left him bankrupt. His new wife expected a lifestyle he couldn't provide. Credit card companies were threatening legal action. He saw no legitimate way out of his financial hole. The opportunity arose from his trusted position within the CIA's Soviet division, which gave him access to the identities of nearly every U.S. asset in the USSR, combined with a shockingly complacent and trusting bureaucracy that failed to monitor its own personnel. Ames worked in counterintelligence, the very office responsible for protecting CIA operations from penetration by hostile intelligence services. His job gave him access to the most sensitive information in the agency: the identities of sources, the details of operations, the methods and techniques used to recruit and communicate with agents. And because he was in counterintelligence, no one suspected him. The foxes, after all, don't guard the henhouse, or so everyone thought. And finally, his rationalization was built on a foundation of years of professional resentment and a corrosive sense of entitlement. He had convinced himself that the system was flawed, that he was smarter than his bosses, and that he was owed more than he was getting. Ames had spent his entire career watching less capable officers get promoted ahead of him. He had watched Ivy League graduates and military veterans rise through the ranks while he stagnated. He felt undervalued, overlooked, disrespected. This resentment made it easier for him to rationalize his betrayal. The agency had failed him, he told himself. They didn't appreciate his contributions.
They didn't pay him what he was worth, so why shouldn't he take what he deserved from someone who would pay? Once he took that first $50,000 payment, each subsequent betrayal became psychologically easier. The moral calculus faded into the background until human lives were no longer human lives, but simply items on a balance sheet, commodities to be sold to the highest bidder. The first betrayal is always the hardest. After that, it becomes routine. The psychological barriers break down. What was once unthinkable becomes ordinary. Psychologists call this moral disengagement. It's a process by which people convince themselves that unethical behavior is acceptable. They use various techniques. They minimize the harm they're causing. They blame others for forcing them into the situation. They dehumanize their victims. Ames did all of these. He convinced himself that the agents he was betraying were just doing their jobs, taking their own risks. He told himself that if they were caught, it was their own fault for choosing to spy. He blamed the CIA for not paying him enough, forcing him to find other sources of income. Most disturbingly, he dehumanized his victims. They weren't real people to him. They were abstractions, names on a list, commodities to be traded. He never thought about their families, their children, their hopes and dreams. They were simply inventory to be sold. This psychological distancing allowed him to continue his betrayal for 9 years without apparent guilt or remorse. Behind the sanitized spy jargon, the damage assessments, and the legal proceedings are the real, gut-wrenching human tragedies. At least 10 individuals who put their absolute trust in the United States and the CIA were captured, interrogated, and ultimately led to a cold, damp basement in Moscow's Lefortovo prison, where they were forced to their knees and shot in the back of the head. One of those men, Sergei Motorin, was an officer Ames had personally known. They had worked together, shared meals, engaged in the casual conversations that colleagues have. Motorin had a wife and young children who would never know his final resting place or the truth of his fate. His family was told he had died of a heart attack while on assignment. They were not permitted to see his body. They were given ashes in an urn and told to ask no questions. For years they believed the official story. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union, when KGB archives were opened, did Motorin's family learn the truth. Their husband and father had been executed as a traitor. He had been working for American intelligence, and he had been betrayed by an American intelligence officer who sold his name for cash. The psychological trauma for the families was immense. Not only had they lost their loved ones, but they learned they had been living with lies for years. Their entire understanding of their family member's life had been false. These are the forgotten victims whose profound sacrifices are the true and lasting measure of Ames' treachery. Their brutal, lonely ends are precisely why counterintelligence matters so profoundly. It's not just about protecting secrets, it's about protecting lives. Every time a bureaucracy shrugs its shoulders at unexplained wealth, or a supervisor avoids asking uncomfortable questions of a subordinate, the door is open just a crack for another betrayal. The CIA failed these agents. The agency that recruited them, trained them, promised to protect them, failed. And that failure had deadly consequences. Aldrich Ames traded their lives, their families, their trust, and their shared humanity for a bigger house and a better car. He traded human beings for a Jaguar and Italian marble countertops and expensive wine. It is a chilling and permanent reminder that the real cost of complacency is measured not in dollars, but in shattered lives and unmarked graves. The Aldrich Ames case is a masterclass in how ordinary, mundane failures of personal character, of institutional oversight, of simple human curiosity, can combine to create a historic and devastating catastrophe. It was the sordid story of a mediocre employee, a man buried in personal debt and professional resentment, who discovered that the simplest way to get rich was to sell state secrets that would lead directly to the murder of strangers he had never even met. The CIA, an institution that so often saw itself as infallible and elite, had somehow forgotten the most basic rule: to check its own books and watch its own people. The agency that so prided itself on recruiting the best and brightest, on outsmarting adversaries, on protecting America's secrets, had been penetrated by one of its own mediocre officers for nearly a decade.
The institutional arrogance was stunning. The CIA believed it was immune to penetration. The agency believed its officers were too patriotic, too dedicated, too well compensated to betray their country. This assumption made them blind to the warning signs that were present for years. The ultimate lesson from the Ames affair is not that all spies are brilliant, calculating villains, but that even the most powerful and sophisticated institutions must remain humble enough to police their own deep-seated flaws. The next traitor will not be a caricature from a Hollywood thriller. They will not have the swagger of James Bond or the cunning of a movie villain. They will look like the person in the next cubicle, the one whose lifestyle suddenly and inexplicably seems disconnected from their salary. They will be ordinary, unremarkable, forgettable, just like Aldrich Ames. Betrayal rarely looks dramatic. It looks mundane, unremarkable, and utterly, terrifyingly ordinary. Today, Aldrich Ames sits in a federal prison cell, forgotten by most of the world. He is an old man now, in his 80s, serving out his life sentence in obscurity. He receives no visitors. He has no friends. He spends his days in the prison library reading books, writing letters that no one answers. The money is long gone, seized by the government, returned to the Treasury. The house was sold. The Jaguar was auctioned. The expensive lifestyle he betrayed his country for lasted less than a decade. But the damage he caused will last forever. The 10 men he sent to their deaths cannot be brought back. The families he destroyed cannot be made whole. The intelligence networks he compromised took decades to rebuild. And somewhere in Russia, in unmarked graves, lie the men who trusted America and paid with their lives. Their names deserve to be remembered: Valery Martinov, Sergei Motorin, Dmitry Polyakov, Adolf Tolkachev, Leonid Polishuk, and others whose names remain classified, whose families still do not know the truth, whose sacrifices remain unacknowledged. They were the real victims of Ames's greed. They were the human cost of institutional complacency. They were the price of betrayal. And they must not be forgotten.